They asked me to fetch coffee during a $1 million strategy meeting, so I made sure it was their last. That moment, 12 minutes past 11 on a Tuesday, was the exact point when I realized I'd waited long enough. The man who had just spoken was Thomas, our new marketing director. Barely 6 weeks into the company, already talking down to people like he ran the place. Like I wasn't even in the room. I nodded, stood up without a word, and left the conference table. I took the long hallway around the atrium, walked past the glass staircase, and paused by the indoor garden I used to water when I first joined the company. That was 3 years ago. Back then, I was the only assistant who actually asked for extra work. Not because I was eager to please, but because I was watching. Always watching. No one at the company knew who I really was. Not the interns, not the executives, not even the founder's old secretary, who used to babysit me when I was 9. They called me Claire, the executive assistant. They never called me Claire Tran, daughter of Charles Tran, the founder and majority shareholder of Tran Tech Global. Why? Because I didn't want them to. My father had stepped away from the company after his stroke, but instead of placing me directly on the board like he easily could have, he let me work my way in through a different door. It was my idea. I wanted to understand the people before I led them, and to do that, I needed to disappear into the background, and I did, for 3 years, until Thomas arrived. He didn't ask questions. He didn't listen. He walked in and assumed I was there to take notes, clean up slides, and smile on cue. The others followed his lead. Little by little, I became the invisible assistant again. That was fine, until this quarter's key presentation started falling apart, and Thomas needed someone to blame. Naturally, he blamed the quiet one. I returned to the boardroom with the coffee. The same nods, the same dismissal. But in 48 hours, it wouldn't be me bringing anything to the meeting. It would be me holding the floor. And Thomas, he wouldn't even get past the reception desk. I was treated like I didn't belong. A week before the quarterly meeting, Thomas sent an internal memo listing the names of contributors for our upcoming strategy deck. My name wasn't on it, which was odd considering I had compiled half of the market analysis they were now using. When I quietly mentioned this to him, just a short, polite hallway conversation, he gave me a look I can only describe as practiced condescension. "Claire," he said, smiling in that tight corporate way, "you're an assistant. You're not required to be on every project. We need to stay in our lanes, yeah? Stay in our lanes. Right." The next day, our design lead forwarded me the wrong version of the client pitch deck, full of formatting errors, outdated graphs, and missing disclaimers. When I flagged it, Thomas blamed me in front of the whole team, not subtly either. I assumed Claire would double-check before sending anything out. I guess next time we'll know not to rely on non-specialists. Non-specialist. That was the new euphemism for beneath us. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I just nodded, took the heat, and updated the file properly, without asking for thanks. I wasn't there for praise. I was there for the pattern. It kept going. Every week, the internal team meeting got smaller. At first, I thought they were being rescheduled without me. Then I realized I had been deliberately removed from the calendar invites. When I asked one of the junior analysts, someone I had mentored, mind you, why I wasn't included, she said, "I thought you were focusing more on admin stuff now." Admin stuff. By now, Thomas was holding mini meetings at his desk, with the others huddled around him like kids under a blanket fort. If I walked by, they went silent, and I just kept smiling. The final straw? An email. Not addressed to me, not even meant to be seen. But someone hit reply all by mistake, and I received it anyway. "Let's just move forward without Claire," Thomas had written. "From now on, treat her as a background asset. No need to loop her into strategic decisions." Background asset. That phrase stayed with me longer than I'd like to admit. I didn't cry. I didn't confront him. Instead, I opened a folder on my desktop that I had been maintaining for months. Screenshots, memos, copies of edited decks I'd created but wasn't credited for. and a time-stamped file of the restructuring proposal that, ironically, Thomas had tried to take credit for. The same one I had drafted and presented in private to my father's board 2 quarters earlier. I checked the calendar. 3 days left until the quarterly meeting. Just enough time to schedule a conversation with legal. 3 days before the quarterly meeting, we had our biannual performance reviews. It was one of the few things I actually looked forward to, not because I needed validation, but because it gave me insight into how people saw themselves, and others, when they thought no one was really watching. I wasn't scheduled to lead any sessions, but I had prepared some feedback notes on the new marketing strategies, particularly how the team was failing to apply customer segmentation properly. A junior analyst had been using outdated demographic data, which could have cost us the pitch with our European partners. I knew this. I'd seen it coming weeks ago, and I had warned Thomas in private. He ignored me. Now, in the review session, he brought it up himself, as a minor hiccup. "We had a little slip with the EU deck," he said, arms folded. "But honestly, that's on some of the legacy processes we inherited. I'm already implementing new frameworks." I cleared my throat gently. If I may, actually, the issue stemmed from improper use of the 2020 dataset. I flagged it 2 weeks ago in the version log. The room went quiet. Not defensive, just indifferent. Thomas didn't look at me. He looked at the VP of operations and said flatly, "That's not relevant to this discussion. Let's stay on topic." Then he moved on, like I hadn't spoken at all, like I hadn't existed at all. No one questioned him. No one backed me up. A few avoided my gaze altogether. That moment wasn't just humiliating, it was clarifying. I realized it wasn't just Thomas who chose to minimize me. It was a culture that enabled it. A hierarchy so obsessed with noise, it couldn't hear what didn't shout. After the meeting, one of the product leads stopped me by the elevators. "Don't take it personally," he said with a shrug. "You know how it is. You're not exactly in strategy." I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw someone who had never once built anything on his own. Someone who lived in slide decks and buzzwords. And I just smiled. "You're right," I said. "I'm not in strategy. But soon, I would be." 2 days before the quarterly meeting, Thomas called an emergency team huddle. Apparently, the pitch deck for our international expansion was behind schedule. The analytics were incomplete, the visuals unrefined, and the messaging, frankly, was a mess. It was a deck I had spent 3 weeks refining, but by the time Thomas sent the final version to the exec team, it looked like a Frankenstein of misaligned fonts, placeholder charts, and jargon-heavy nonsense. I hadn't been asked to review it before it went out. And now? He stood at the whiteboard, red marker in hand, speaking like a coach mid-halftime. "We dropped the ball, folks. This kind of delay reflects poorly on all of us. But more importantly, it reflects poorly on those who are responsible for content execution." His eyes flicked toward me. I said nothing, not because I didn't have anything to say, but because I knew no one was going to listen. Not yet. "Claire," he continued, "you had early access to the slide structure. Why wasn't this caught sooner?" A few heads turned. I looked around the room. These were people who had received my annotated draft 2 weeks ago. Some of them had thanked me privately, but now they sat like stone. I spoke calmly. The version I submitted included corrected headers, updated graphs, and alignment notes. That version wasn't used. Thomas smiled, tight-lipped, performative. "Well, regardless, we needed coordination, and it didn't happen. Let's not point fingers. Let's just fix it." Pointing fingers without pointing fingers. Classic. Later that afternoon, I logged into the shared drive and found something new. A version control document marked Final V4 Thomas. My name had been stripped from the metadata. All comments I'd made were gone. I clicked through. Not a trace of me anywhere. Even my folder of research notes had been moved to archive. A symbolic deletion, more than a technical one. But it was effective. I was being erased, methodically, quietly. And still, I smiled. Because while they were busy deleting footnotes, I was finalizing documents with legal weight. That night, I sent a brief message to one of our in-house lawyers. No accusations, no drama, just a single line. Please confirm the procedure for submitting evidence of hostile work redirection within a private equity holding. 10 minutes later, she responded with 2 PDFs and a quiet. Are you okay? I'm fine, I replied. Because I was ready. The day before the quarterly meeting, the company sent out a group email titled Final Logistics, Singapore Strategy Delegation. I wasn't on it. I blinked at the screen, refreshed the page, checked the recipients again. No Claire. Even though I had drafted 80% of the original proposal, even though I was the one who first flagged Singapore as a strategic foothold, before the rest of the market caught on, even though Thomas had, weeks ago, said to my face, "We'll make sure you're part of the travel team." Apparently, we had changed our minds. I opened Slack and messaged one of the coordinators, someone who once cried in front of me when she didn't get her promotion, and I was the only one who stayed after the meeting to console her. Hey, just noticed I wasn't included in the Singapore travel brief. Is that an oversight? She took 10 minutes to reply. Hi, Claire. Sorry. Thomas made a last-minute decision to streamline the team. Said he wanted folks with more direct client interface. I stared at those words. Direct client interface. As if I had spent the last year managing vendors, consultants, and partner execs from behind a screen. As if I hadn't just walked the client's vice president of strategy through our systems roadmap 4 months ago, alone, while Thomas was on vacation. This wasn't about streamlining. This was about cutting me off from visibility, from ownership, from the future. I didn't reply. I didn't storm into Thomas's office. Instead, I stood up, left my desk, and walked out to the parking lot behind the building. The wind was sharp, tugging at the hem of my coat. Across the lot, I could see the corner suite window where Thomas now worked. It used to be my father's. Funny thing, he never locked that office. Even when he was CEO, he said, "A leader should never be hard to reach. Doors are for closing when others need privacy, not when you need power." Thomas had blinds drawn, and the door closed 90% of the time. Some doors shut themselves, I suppose. I returned to my desk, opened my private archive, double-checked the call logs, the internal emails, the timelines of erasure. Everything was in place. Everything but one final trigger. And as fate would have it, that arrived in my inbox 20 minutes later. It was late afternoon when the final email came in. Subject line: Clarification on role scope. Claire Tran. Sender: Thomas. Recipients: Leadership Team, CC, HR, CC, Ops, CC, me. Yes, he CC'd me, like a formality, like an afterthought. Hi all, it began. Just wanted to clarify Claire's scope moving forward. While she's been helpful in supporting logistics and admin, let's align expectations for Q4 and beyond. Claire will no longer be looped into strategic initiatives, client-facing decisions, or cross-functional planning. From this point on, treat her as a background asset. No need to include her on broader discussions unless explicitly instructed. Hope this reduces confusion. Thanks. Background asset. That phrase again, but this time not whispered, not implied, typed, broadcast, endorsed. I read the email twice, then once more, just to make sure I wasn't misinterpreting. I wasn't. The word that struck me most wasn't background, it was explicitly. As if my inclusion required justification. As if my value now had to be approved case by case, like a questionable expense. And yet, no one on the chain replied to disagree. Not ops, not HR, not the same VP who once called me the most precise communicator we have. Not the guy who used my risk matrix in his own presentation and won a bonus. Silence. Digital complicity. I sat there for a long time, staring at the screen, not because I was hurt, but because it was so clean, so efficient, so final. That was the brilliance of Thomas. He didn't scream. He didn't humiliate. He simply erased, and then made sure everyone else helped him hold the whiteout pen. I stood up, walked into the break room, poured myself a cup of tea. People walked past me. One nodded, one didn't. No one knew that I had just made the final adjustment to the personnel docket. No one knew I had already booked the boardroom for Friday. No one knew I had spent the last 4 months quietly transferring decision authority for department-level terminations to the COO's sign-off, a role that hadn't been publicly named yet. And no one, absolutely no one, knew that role would be mine. Not until 10 a.m. Friday morning, when all the background assets would be sitting at the head of the table. Friday. 9:58 a.m. The quarterly strategy meeting was already underway when I entered the boardroom. Thomas was standing near the big screen, fiddling with the remote, trying to get the presentation to load properly. The usual suspects sat around the conference table: VPs, department heads, a few regional directors flown in for optics. I was the only one standing. Nobody looked twice, until Charles Tran walked in. My father. It was the first time he'd returned to headquarters in over a year. He walked slowly but firmly, dressed in his signature gray blazer, no tie. Everyone rose. A few rushed to shake his hand, unsure whether to act formal or casual. Thomas looked especially nervous. He hadn't expected the founder himself to attend. "Charles," he said, forcing a laugh. "What a surprise. Didn't know you were joining us today." My father didn't answer. He simply walked over, placed a hand on my shoulder, and turned to face the room. "Before we begin," he said, voice calm but iron-edged, "there's a brief announcement. We've had a shift in executive structure, effective immediately." He turned slightly and nodded at me. "Claire Tran will now be assuming the role of Chief Operating Officer, with full authority over personnel, project management, and strategic planning across all departments." The room froze. You could almost hear someone stop breathing. I didn't speak right away. I wanted the moment to linger. Let the discomfort steep. Then I stepped forward. "For those unfamiliar," I said, looking directly at Thomas, "I've been here for 3 years. Some of you know me as the assistant who scheduled your meetings, reviewed your decks, and fixed your formatting errors. But I was also the one who flagged international compliance risks you ignored, restructured 3 core workflows without asking for credit, and mentored the junior staff you didn't even bother learning the names of. I was invisible, by choice." I glanced at Thomas, who had sunk into his seat, eyes wide, jaw tight. "But invisibility doesn't mean absence," I continued. "It just means I was watching." I walked over to the screen, clicked open a new presentation, not the one Thomas had prepared. Mine. The opening slide was titled Restoration, Accountability, and Culture Reset. Effective today, departmental restructuring begins. Several contracts will be reviewed for behavior misaligned with the company's core values. No one moved. No one dared. I wasn't shouting. I wasn't angry. I didn't need to be. When power finally speaks, it doesn't have to raise its voice. Thomas stood fumbling with a response. "Claire, if there's anything you think I mishandled, I'd love the chance to—" "You'll have the chance to review everything," I said. "After your HR exit interview." A pause. Someone exhaled. Maybe it was me. Then I closed the laptop. Meeting adjourned. And just like that, I walked out. Not fast, not slow, but with the kind of silence that echoes louder than applause. By the time I returned to my office, now 3 floors above the one I'd worked in for the past 3 years, my inbox was already filling up. Apologies, clarifications, meeting requests. Too late. I had already sent out the termination memos, not mass emails. No drama. Just individual notifications, reviewed line by legal and countersigned by me the day before. Quiet, clean, undeniable. Thomas's email was the first to bounce back. He had already been locked out of the system. 2 others, senior managers who had forwarded or co-signed emails minimizing my role, were placed on administrative leave pending investigation. They would not be returning. One of the junior leads who'd called me non-strategic tried to call my assistant. My assistant didn't answer. Instead, she forwarded the call to a holding voicemail titled Policy Escalation Non-Priority. The same language they used on me for years. Funny how fast the hierarchy flips when the foundation shifts. That afternoon, I called a town hall. Optional attendance, but nearly the entire company showed up. I didn't give a speech. I played a slideshow. No names, no accusations. Just real quotes, anonymous but recognizable, collected from anonymous surveys I had initiated under the pretense of admin feedback. Things like people who don't speak up probably don't have much to say. Assistants are not paid to think. You have to be visible to matter. Then a black slide with white text. If these sound familiar, they should. Because starting today, we're no longer promoting loudness over competence, or charisma over contribution, or power over principle. I let the room sit with that for 10 full seconds. Then I closed the laptop. Any questions? No one raised a hand. A few lowered their heads. And for once, not out of shame, but maybe recognition. Later that evening, while walking past the 6th-floor elevator, I overheard someone whisper, "She didn't yell. She didn't threaten. She just ended them." I didn't stop walking, didn't even turn around. Because I hadn't ended anyone. They had done that themselves. All I did was stop protecting them from their consequences. The apologies came slowly, and then all at once. Some were long, filled with regret and self-analysis. Others were short, just a line or two, meant to acknowledge, not necessarily to repair. I read them all. I even smiled at a few. But I didn't reply. I didn't forward them. I didn't share them with anyone. I simply moved each one into a folder I had created that morning, titled Not Needed. Not because I held a grudge, but because I no longer needed validation from those who had once erased me. Recognition that comes after power shifts isn't recognition, it's survival instinct. And I had no interest in offering comfort to those who had comfortably ignored me. I didn't want apologies. I wanted change. So that's where I placed my energy. We started small. One policy, one team meeting, one uncomfortable conversation at a time. I replaced feedback forms with guided reflections. I removed the anonymous complaint box and added a listening circle where people had to show up, face to face, and speak without hiding behind titles or roles. More importantly, I introduced one practice I had learned long before the corporate world: pausing before reaction. Before you respond, I told my managers, breathe. Ask, am I listening to understand or to control? We made it part of our onboarding. We practiced it in leadership retreats. Eventually, I didn't have to remind people anymore. The culture began to shift, not overnight, but steadily. Like water carving stone, not by force, but by consistency. I, Claire Tran, stood tall after the storm, the echoes of their apologies, and the hum of a reborn Nexus tech fading behind me. I didn't chase their cheers or cling to their guilt, their regret, their newfound respect. Just passing clouds, fleeting noise in a quiet sky. Mindfulness lit my path. True victory isn't being hailed a hero. It's letting go of the need to be seen. Pain cuts deep. I felt every barb of their scorn. But freedom runs deeper. Mindfulness taught me this. Don't curse their blindness. Choose peace over pride. Every choice I made was a step toward calm, not a shot at their ego. Their mistakes caught up with them. My actions set me free. I only wanted them to learn what I had. Pause, breathe, see the human before the title. To anyone who's been underestimated, know this. Your hurt is real, but your strength is greater. Don't fight to prove them wrong. Pause, breathe, and own your worth. That's healing, not their defeat, but your power to rise above. Pain hits hard, but you can hit reset and find peace. I didn't need them to see me as a victor, only to learn silence before judgment. How do you rise above being underestimated? Drop it in the comments.